1934, the International Motor Show in Berlin. Here, Adolf Hitler launches a key part of his plan for world domination, a web of freeways right across his future European empire, from Paris to Moscow.
Hitler
fetishized mobility and loved cars, and you could tell that.
Das merkt man auch.
Hitler's armies will move across them with lightning speed, and German settlers will be able to spread rapidly across the conquered lands. Hitler is confident his network of super roads will make Germany great again.
In my opinion, the most appropriate way to guide the German people back into work is to get the German economy back into gear through great monumental works. The Reich freeways were promoted and propagandized, of course, as the roads of the Führer.
Hitler is determined to use the freeways to return Germany to power after humiliating defeat in the First World War. So he forces millions of young Germans to build them by hand.
The building of the Autobahn was done deliberately in a way to make work for as many hands as possible, that it wasn't particularly mechanized. There are just a lot of guys out there with shovels.
Hitler also promises to build millions of cheap people's cars for the workers. But his fraud is revealed when he steals their money.
Not one person who subscribed to the car ever got one because the war came and it was converted to military purposes in the factory.
Instead, millions of forced workers and prisoners struggle and die building the Nazis' roads, because Hitler only has one real drive: to wage war. His freeways are just another route to Germany's destruction. (1924), Landsberg Castle in southern Germany. Adolf Hitler is imprisoned here for staging a coup, but the authorities are surprisingly tolerant. The conditions in Hitler's fortress prison are far from harsh. He has many visitors and many books. During his enforced idleness, Hitler rereads one of his favorites, the autobiography of Henry Ford. I will build a motor car for the great multitude. It will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one and enjoy with his family the blessing of hours of pleasure in God's great open spaces. Hitler is inspired by Ford's vision of mass motorization. He also identifies with Ford himself, a brilliant industrialist from humble origins, who creates the world's most famous car, the Model T. As soon as he's released, Hitler starts campaigning for the Nazi Party, right across Germany. But now he refuses to take boring trains. Instead, he prefers to travel by car, to demonstrate his vision of national reconstruction through motorization.
Hitler enjoyed driving powerful Mercedes cars at high speed, or being chauffeured in them. Hitler was a real car fan.
But Hitler's motorcade is something of a novelty. At the time, car ownership is still a privilege of the rich.
Germany had fewer motor vehicles per capita than either Britain or France, to say nothing of the United States, during the 1920s and the early 1930s.
Hitler wants to do for Germany what Ford has done for the United States. So he pushes his party to promise three things: jobs, cars, and roads for everyone.
Hat das dann sehr schnell durchgesetzt.
Very quickly, he asserted and propagandized that the German economy should be grown or restored to health, mainly through car manufacturing and road construction.
Erfolgen sollte.
In 1933, Hitler consults an expert on road construction who is also a loyal Nazi Party member. His name is Fritz Todt.
Todt war von Hause aus Bauingenieur.
Todt was a construction engineer, a road builder. He had a senior position at a very reputable construction company. He joined the Nazi Party very early on, in 1922 or 23, I think. In contrast to many other Nazis, he was very competent in his field, and most people describe him as a level-headed guy. The most crucial person in the development and realization of the freeways was definitely Fritz Todt.
Todt presents Hitler with a plan for a national freeway network. He argues it will create jobs, boost tourism, and even have strategic military benefits. However, Todt's proposal isn't original. He borrows from plans created a decade earlier by the freeway lobby Hafraba.
The Autobahn program begins in the Weimar Republic. That the first Autobahn is the one between Bonn and Cologne, which was supposed to be the first leg of an Autobahn going from Hamburg down to Frankfurt, down to Basel, the Hafraba. So that the idea of the Autobahn are already there.
It's more than just an idea. These are comprehensive blueprints.
These plans were very meticulous and were very advanced by the late 1920s. They had drawings for every 12-mile stretch down to every last detail, which the Nazis were able to base their plans on, with only minor variations.
When the Nazis come to power, Hitler appoints Todt General Inspector of Roads. He gets to work immediately.
Naturally, sweeping promises about route completions were made. By 1937-38, 6,000 miles were meant to have been completed. The overall plan envisaged 14,000 miles of freeway.
Im Verkehr beginnen wir nunmehr neue Schlagadern zu bauen. Wir haben 4 Jahre damals uns ausgebeten und wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen zum Nutzen und Frommen unseres deutschen Volkes. Damit wohl in erster Linie für den deutschen Arbeiter.
Germany had 35 or more % of the workforce unemployed when the Nazis came to power. The depression in Germany was deeper than anywhere else in Europe, and it's a big reason why the Nazis managed to come to power, because they promised to try and deal with it.
People were fed the propaganda, this is a means to an end, a great glory will arise from this, and you're a part of that great glory. In other words, this idea that we live in epic times, you want to be part of that, then get digging the motorway, because everything will come to you, all the goodies, because then we'll be able to deliver by lorry and we'll be delivered fast, and you'll have a great future awaiting you.
Many unemployed people put great effort into applying for jobs on the freeways. The Federal Archives have records of the unemployed sending in poems and using these poems to put themselves forward to finally get a job on the freeways. Queuing up for the dole, many years I spent. Now, finally, I hold a shovel in my hand. Doing physical work in nature out there worked on me like a miraculous cure. This is why I work with gratitude for the master builder of all time to realise the jewel in the crown of his monumental plan, the Reich Freeway.
The building of the Autobahn was done deliberately in such a way as to make work for as many hands as possible, that it wasn't particularly mechanized. There are just a lot of guys out there with shovels.
The routine was that workers were given work clothes and equipped with spades and shovels. The authorities would officially release them from the estate of unemployment. Then they marched off or were transported to the construction sites by lorries, which were driven by members of the SA in a kind of triumphal march. The population showed great interest. Sometimes hundreds of thousands of people crowded around these construction sites.
These back-to-work ceremonies take place all around the country. Todt carefully schedules freeway construction to spread the propaganda message as widely as possible. All Germans are meant to feel that they are directly benefiting from the freeways.
The commissioning of the construction sites always ran to more or less the same pattern, which was designed for propaganda purposes in both film and sound. It was very important that the radio was always there to broadcast, as well as the weekly newsreel.
And when the cameras are rolling, even the Führer gets his hands dirty. Hitler often tells the workers that he understands their needs because he too had suffered during his humble, earlier life, before his rise to power.
Back then, they used to say, "What does he want?" that former builder or painter. But I am happy and proud that fate forced me down this road. It is perhaps why I have a deeper understanding than others of the German worker, of his nature, but also of his vital needs.
Yet, in the 1930s, one thing the workers definitely don't have are cars. The existing models are much too expensive. But Hitler has a plan. He intends to force German manufacturers to produce a cheap, sturdy vehicle for the masses, the people's car. But who will pay for it? Hitler is promised to vastly increase car production and road building to boost Germany's economy and put the unemployed back to work. It seems to be working. A national freeway network is taking shape, and it features prominently in Nazi propaganda.
It's hard to imagine today the extent to which the freeway shaped the perceptions of the population across all media.
Fritz Todt takes charge of freeway-related propaganda personally. He edits the weekly magazine The Road and commissions films which portray the Führer's project as a miraculous road to recovery. But this doesn't distract him from overseeing all the technical details.
So the freeway was intended to meet the following criteria: to have 2 lanes in each direction, separated by a central reservation. It was meant to have no junctions and was reserved for car traffic only. In the early planning stages, quite a few railway engineers were involved, which means that their plans followed railway construction conventions. An elevated track, preferably going in a totally straight line over long distances.
Todt dismisses these coldly efficient straight lines. He prefers a route design known as the curved path.
In this conception of the curved path, 2 aspects come together. First, that landscape should be experienced, which links to the emphasis on travel and tourism, which was a priority. So they wanted to open up a panoramic vista for the driver. To a large extent, this was copied from the USA. These designs were based on the idea of landscape entertaining the driving audience.
The first completed stretch of freeway is opened in May 1935. Thousands line the route, but currently very few Germans own a car. But Hitler is planning a solution.
The German people were meant to be furnished with the German people's car, similar to the Americans' Ford Model T, and as soon as possible.
The people's car has to be cheap enough for workers. Hitler tells German manufacturers that it must cost no more than 2 months' average earnings.
It must be possible to give the German people a motor vehicle that does not cost more than a mid-range motorbike used to. The price was set at 990 marks by diktat. The car was not allowed to cost any more, but economically, this was completely unachievable.
It was a big problem for the motor industry because selling it for 1,000 marks was not going to bring them in any profit.
Despite their reservations, the car industry builds a prototype designed by Ferdinand Porsche.
It only just about managed to go without any frills or any luxuries at all. Very, very uncomfortable.
But the manufacturers calculate that even a basic people's car will cost far more to make than Hitler has decreed. When they tell him, he's furious.
I was told this is impossible. My only reply to this is what is possible in other countries is also possible in Germany. I hate that word impossible, since it has always been the mark of people not daring enough to make and to implement great decisions. The automobile must become the means of transportation for the people.
And what the Führer wants, the Führer gets.
The way the economy worked in Nazi Germany was it was directed and controlled, increasingly so, by the Nazi government for political reasons. And then in the end, I mean, Hitler, of course, could not be resisted, and he pushed through the idea.
The car firms are desperate not to be stuck with a loss-making model, so they cast their eyes on another source of funds for the people's car. All workers are now forced to join the Nazi Workers' Organization, the German Labor Front. It takes over independent trade unions and confiscates their assets of nearly 500 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to more than $8.5 billion US today. To produce the people's car, Hitler, like his hero Henry Ford, builds his own factory, and he steals German labor front money to fund it. So he is forcing German workers to take on the risk of this loss-making venture, now rebranded the Strength Through Joy car.
This means that, from the word go, this was an enterprise dependent on subsidies. A new factory was built, the Strength Through Joy plant, which later became the Wolfsburg plant.
This factory is planned to be the largest in the world, bigger even than Ford's, with enormous output.
Propaganda was spread that from 1939, 1.5 million people's cars would be built each year.
The Nazis come up with an ingenious way of taking yet more money from the workers.
There was a peculiar, I guess, hire purchase system where first you had to pay for the car and then you got it somewhat later.
Sales are limited to German Labor Front members who have to buy a Strength Through Joy savings stamp every week until they reach the purchase price. But if they miss a single payment, everything they've spent is forfeited. So the workers are paying for their cars even before the factory is built.
This was a new thing, the idea that I in my remote village might actually be able to have a car. And the Nazi party were telling all the time you could. It was only a matter of waiting, be patient and you'll get one. So a lot of it was aspirational consumption. You lived in hope, and they played on your hope.
Paying for a car they don't yet own is not the worst problem faced by German workers. The Nazis are now forcing millions of young men to do compulsory manual labor for the state. Hitler's freeways are spreading across Germany. He is selling the workers the dream of mobility and arguing there's a special character to German work.
I am asking you to bear in mind that we live in a time which sees work as an essential matter, and that we want to build a state which values work for its own sake and respects the worker because he is fulfilling a duty to the nation.
The Nazis create a new national organization to embody this ideal, the Reich Labor Service. It takes over existing job creation schemes around the country. School leavers, students, and long-term unemployed men are forced to do at least 6 months' service, creating an army of cheap labor. The propaganda message is clear. Physical labor should be admired and experienced by every German, regardless of social class.
I ask you to keep in mind that we want to build a state which uses its labor service to teach everyone, even the pampered son of high-born parents, to value work and respect physical labor in the service of the national community.
Whether you were a prince or whether you were a pauper, you had to build roads.
The Reich Labor Service's propaganda also says it's unifying the country and overcoming regional differences.
The Reich Labor Service was an important organization of the Nazi regime because it was an important element of Nazi propaganda. The most important propaganda opportunity was certainly the annual rally in Nuremberg, where the Reichslabor Service since 1933 was always a central element of the propaganda marches and demonstrations. So you would have 100,000 young men marching in front of Hitler, showing to the Führer that this organization was a powerful and important tool for the regime.
Kamerad, woher stammst du? Aus Friesenland. Und du, Kamerad? Aus Schlesien. Von der Waterkant. Vom Schwarzwald. Aus Dresden. Von der Donau. Vom Rhein. Und von der Saar. Ein Volk. Ein Führer.
This is, of course, one of the great achievements of propaganda. This elevation of labor, partly by making everyone for a period a laborer, but continuously producing posters and films and so forth, celebrating labor as really the sinews of the culture, the foundation of the culture.
It was a symbol of the regime in its attempt to overcome the Great Depression. It had young men, mostly men, put to work to show that the regime was trying to help the people, that it was an active attempt to overcome the crisis. And that was the most important propaganda element that it actually had. Young men walking with their spades through small villages, singing their songs, looking happy, and being back to work.
But beneath the happy image lurks the power of the Nazi state.
The Labour Service obviously had an element of coercion in it. And the Nazi idea of work was one of self-sacrifice for the nation, whether you volunteered or not.
The service is run in a quasi-military fashion.
The Reich Labour Service had its specific uniform. It was brown. It didn't look particularly nice. People in the Third Reich also complained sometimes about the way the uniforms looked. It was almost like a military uniform, and there were also all the badges and things that normally distinguish people in military organizations.
Each of us had a work shovel and, in addition, a second spade which we polished to perfection, which we handled like a gun. We were drilled in presenting it so that it flashed in the sunlight.
All of this was very powerful propaganda, and it was very, very persuasive to people looking at Germany from outside. Sir Neville Henderson, the British ambassador, he actually was totally taken in. He said, these are marvelous structures. You know, not everyone in Nazi Germany is an evil clown. It has some very great men, and it's created some fantastic nationalizing institution which destroy all the barriers of social class and create solidarity. It's a marvelous thing. In many ways, it is the new dawn they promise.
Relentless propaganda shows the young men of the Reich Labor Service as heroes, serving the national community by constructing Hitler's roads. In fact, they're not really up to the job.
The workforce of the Labour Service was unskilled labor. We have to remember that these are 7, 18, 19-year-old young men from all walks of life who have to do this kind of service, and therefore it is impossible to think of them as a qualified workforce. What it mainly did was infrastructure projects, such as cultivating the ground, irrigation work, for instance, but also some other jobs in that field of building smaller pathways, roads. So that was the main job in the early years.
For the most complex work of freeway construction, Fritz Todt hires skilled labor and qualified engineers. They are vital as he plans to build 12,500 miles of road across Germany. And progress in the first few years of Nazi rule is swift. Nearly 400 miles are completed each year. The completion of every regional section of freeway is celebrated and broadcast nationwide, with the Führer present painting a picture of future prosperity.
In 10 Jahren wird schon hier in Massen der deutsche Volkswagen darüber brauen. Dazwischen aber Hunderttausende an Omnibussen.
Hitler claims his make-work schemes are curing unemployment. The reality is different. While it is true that unemployment levels are coming down,
But it would be wrong to say that the labor service played an important role in reducing them. Other factors really were more important to explain the economic upswing. It had started already in 1932, prior to the rise to power, and a good part of it also owed to the rearmament of the military. So in that sense, it was also an artificial and aggressive form of overcoming the economic crisis.
And the Nazi state is tightening its grip on the working class.
There was the idea and the rhetoric of supporting workers and celebrating also the hard physical work of laborers, but in practice the regime did little to really support them. If you look at the development of wages, for instance, you see a downward trend in the second half of the 1930s.
Workers had formed trade unions to protect their interests. But the German Labor Front, which replaces them, exists to control the workers, not represent them. The Labor Front doesn't care about the conditions of those toiling on the freeways.
So obviously in the moving workplace of building a motorway, they'd be living in very rough temporary accommodation. They'd be served pretty basic food, the wages weren't great, and if you objected, you got into trouble.
The day would have started with flag raising and then very much a routine day of work and of labour.
Die Arbeiter
They had to do heavy physical work, 8 hours a day, sometimes 10 hours a day. And this led to severe health problems. There was a new phrase which nearly gained the status of a new medical condition, shoveler's sickness. This was caused by the uneven strain when shifting soil, and it presented itself through symptoms such as torn ligaments, joint strain, back pain and such like. They were not to be envied.
Even after work time was regimented too, so that the German Labour Front was responsible for after work hours as well. So the regime was making sure that people's leisure time also was quite heavily regimented.
The Nazis start banning strikes as early as 1933. Yet conditions are so bad on the freeway construction sites that sometimes workers feel they have to lay down their shovels.
In 1934-35, there were some reports of strikes. Now, this is always difficult because officially there were no such things, but we know that there were some minor uprisings.
Strikes in the 1920s caused political unrest. The Nazis will not tolerate such dissent. Workers who had written stirring poems about their new jobs are now chanting different rhymes.
The freeway is knocking us dead. Tomorrow, we'll go back to voting red. But in those cases, the authorities took drastic measures. They threw these people in prison or sent them to re-education camps.
This is the site of one of these camps, a former labor service barracks. After the barracks burned down, the Nazis turned this exposed site into a prison camp for workers. Now, it's a memorial to all who suffered here.
The SS special camp Hinset was used for the retraining of German workers that were accused of antisocial behavior. For instance, they came to work too late, they start drinking alcohol or complained about the bad working conditions. And the conditions must have been, of course, inhumane. The prisoners had no proper uniforms or proper shoes. Climate is very rough, wet and cold. Screams and beatings and barking dogs welcomed the arriving prisoners. They had to work 13 hours a day. The head was shaved. And they had a special haircut, which means in the middle it was very, very small, and the prisoners called it Hinseter Autobahn, and it was actually used just in case a prisoner escaped. Everyone saw from his haircut, you must be a prisoner. This was the intention. The idea was to retrain them, and they had to do hard physical labor, military drill, and in the evenings they were indoctrinated by Nazi ideology.
Hitler is now ready to launch his war to seize the land and resources of Eastern Europe. But first, he needs to secure his western border. So he orders Fritz Todt to create the Nazis' largest and most complex project to date, a huge defensive barrier known as the West Wall. Hitler has mobilized millions of German men to create the infrastructure of the Nazi state. Conditions are harsh as they toil across the land building his network of freeways. But Hitler is also planning to plunge his country into war. So he has another vital task for his conscripted workforce. Before Hitler can seize Eastern Europe, he must protect his rear. He orders Fritz Todt to build an enormous defensive structure, the West Wall, on the border with France. But Todt's workforce is busy building the freeways. So he turns to the unskilled workers of the Reich Labor Service.
Building these fortifications in the west of the country, the so-called Westwall, which was an important new dimension that absorbed many of its units in 1938 and 1939. So the whole idea of education, of indoctrination was less important, and work hours, work days become much longer.
600,000 men build the West Wall, working 7 days a week. Todt's work is so crucial to Hitler's war plans, he grants him authority over the nation's entire construction program, with his own task force, Organization Todt. Now Todt is able to complete the West Wall in just over a year. With its nearly 400 miles of bunkers and fortifications, this is a real line of defense, as well as a show of strength, and it bears a striking resemblance to Todt's other propaganda project.
Der Westwall, wenn man ihn so in der Landschaft liegen sah,
When you saw the West Wall embedded in the landscape, it looked a bit like a prickly freeway, crossing hills and valleys, just like the curved path of the freeways. And the idea was that these massive concrete dragon's teeth and fortifications would stop tanks from penetrating, which is what happened. But perhaps even more powerful was its psychological and visual effect.
Vielleicht sogar mehr als real.
Todt completes the West Wall in summer 1939. His career is made. September 1939. Germany is now at war. At first, Hitler is victorious. As the Reich's borders expand both east and west, Fritz Todt extends his plans for the freeway network. But the new roads are no longer intended for enjoyable drives with scenic views. These roads have an aggressive political purpose, supply lines for the army and routes for future German settlers.
Für den Fall eines Siegs oder vor dem man
They were already making plans for huge thoroughfares that would have connected the empire with the territories they planned to enslave in the event of victory, which they were convinced would come. These plans would have extended the freeway network from Holland, France and Italy, that is, from the west and the south all the way to Moscow.
These are big plans, but even at home, there's not enough labor to build the freeways. Workers have been lured away by the high wages offered creating the West Wall. So, to keep expanding his freeway network, Todt has to find another solution.
It was one that had previously been rejected, mechanization, turning to technology. Remember that in the early years, work was done almost exclusively by hand, and now road construction machines were deployed to replace labor.
On the freeways, mechanization helps, but machines cannot replace men entirely. So Todt is forced to abandon another key Nazi principle.
Schon vorher gab es Pläne.
There had previously been plans to deploy Jews from concentration camps.
Einzusetzen.
Todt had rejected this, arguing that the honorable German freeway should not be sullied by Jewish hands.
Die ehrenvolle deutsche Autobahn solle nicht durch jüdische Hände beschmutzt werden.
Todt reluctantly uses Jewish concentration camp prisoners on the Führer's roads. But the decision does not harm his career. In fact, he gains power when Hitler gives him an even more important job.
During the war, he was made Reich Minister for Armaments and Munitions. He successfully demonstrated his competence and was considered an authority. The organization Todt went east too, of course, to Poland, to Russia, to Ukraine, to build roads, accommodation, and so on. Everything that falls under military engineering, especially bridge construction.
The organization Todt was also really involved in highly destructive tasks during World War II. The most important example is probably building the Durchgangsstraßen, highways basically, to the eastern occupied parts of Europe, where forced labor and many Jewish forced laborers were employed, and there was this idea of exterminating them through work.
From 1941, the organization Todt uses forced labor and prisoners of war to construct these Durchgangsstraßen, or thoroughfares. These men are literally worked to death.
You could argue that the further away you got from the center of the empire, and the further you left behind the area where the population could monitor you, and the further the war progressed and became more problematic, the lower the reluctance to use forced labor, until you didn't even try to hide the fact that people were being worked to death.
The Nazis had this very important idea that people who were not deemed to be part of the national community, of the Volksgemeinschaft, should be excluded and also be exterminated by work.
At first, this extermination through labor only takes place openly on the edges of the Reich. But even within Germany, the regime and private companies have no qualms about using forced labor in every part of the economy. Prisoners of war, along with people from occupied territories, are shipped into Germany to work. And again, the ideological objection to using Jews is abandoned.
After 1939-40, even Jewish forced labor was used, and forced laborers were treated decidedly worse than German workers. They lived in terrible conditions.
Forced labor becomes increasingly necessary for a regime which is sending literally millions of men into their deaths on the Eastern Front.
As the war turns against Germany, the Nazis' dream of mass mobility starts to crumble. The freeways that Hitler is so proud of turn out to be of no use for the military, except Allied bombers. And Hitler's promise of millions of cheap people's cars turns out to be a gigantic fraud. Germany's freeways were conceived by the Nazis as a way to bind the nation together and give unemployed workers back their dignity. But during the Second World War, road building becomes a way to exploit and even exterminate the Nazis' enemies. Forced labor has become an essential part of Germany's economy. At Hitler's car factory, 2/3 of the workforce are forced laborers. But they're not building the promised people's car.
Not one person who subscribed to the car ever got one because the war came and it was converted to military purposes in the factory.
In reality, only 600 cars were built, most of them for display or similar purposes, whereas they built about 50,000 Kübelwagen and about 15,000 amphibious Schwimmwagen, which are military vehicles. The people's car itself only existed in propaganda films or occasional propaganda rides.
More than 300,000 German workers paid their weekly contributions in the hope of owning a people's car. They had hoped in vain. In January 1942, Hitler himself issues a decree banning all private car journeys. No one is now allowed to drive on the Führer's roads, unless it directly supports the war effort. And finally, all freeway construction in Germany comes to a complete stop. But Fritz Todt does not live to see all this.
Todt ist dann im Februar.
In February 1942, Todt was killed in a plane crash when he was visiting Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair.
Ums Leben gekommen.
His death comes as a huge shock to Hitler. Todt's importance to the Nazi project is shown by the grandiose state funeral he is awarded with military honors.
Fritz Todt hatte damit gelockt, dass die Autobahn einen hohen Militär...
Fritz Todt had used the enticing argument that the freeways would play a valuable military role. He had the idea that 60,000 men could be moved from one border to the other within 2 days, but this was delusional. Even if they had completed the freeway network, this would have been impossible. Firstly, because they lacked trucks. Secondly, rail transport was much more efficient. So the military was, in fact, quite skeptical about the freeways, and they were concerned that they might be used by enemy aircraft as guidelines.
Well, the motorways turned out to be incredibly useful for bombers because they were very white and bright, and they went from one city to another, and so you could use them as navigational aids. So they, in the end, were painted over with camouflage.
The Army's fears about the Führer's roads are realized during the 1943 Allied bombing campaign. Germany's decisive defeat at Stalingrad is a sign of even greater reverses to come. But Hitler is in denial and carries on regardless. His propaganda machine starts using a new slogan, Total War.
Total war meant lots of mobilization on the home front as well as on the fighting front. And eventually, in January 1943, the call-up for work began.
Total war had a specific economic purpose, and that is to fully militarize its economy.
The Nazis issued decrees that minimum working hours for all workers must go up. And Hitler is finally forced to accept that women must work in the munitions industry. The very survival of Germany is in doubt. So now, almost every Nazi principle is sacrificed. Even children are drafted into military service. Hitler's top propaganda project, the freeway network, lies unfinished under camouflage. Todt's workers had only managed to build 2,500 miles, less than 20% of the promised network. And despite its scale, the West Wall only holds back Allied forces for a few months. Nazi Germany is now suffering defeat after defeat. The Allies are advancing on all fronts.
Die Alliierten hatten natürlich keine allzu große Ehrfurcht vor der Autobahn.
The Allies, of course, did not show a great deal of respect for the freeways, but drove right over them with their tanks.
Übersät mit zerstörten, ausgebrannten Autos.
The freeways were littered with destroyed, burned-out cars, which had been abandoned as people fled. And finally, the freeways were used to move German prisoners of war because there were no trucks or trains to transport them. As was common with prisoners of war, they were marched along the roads partly to humiliate them. So, once again, the freeways became the roads of the Führer.
Straßen des Führers.
Hitler promised a network of superhighways to link up his European empire. But like so many of his promises, he failed to deliver. In the end, the limited scale of the freeway network reveals the huge difference between Nazi propaganda and the grim reality.